May 8, 1945, Allied military forces had secured complete victory across the European theater. At a temporary detention compound near Regensburg in the American occupation zone of Bavaria, United States Third Army personnel faced an administrative situation without precedent in military history. Approximately 300 female prisoners of war, formerly serving in Wehrmacht auxiliary services, awaited processing for release under standard demobilization protocols established by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The facility commander, Major Robert Henderson of the U.S. Third Army's Military Government Section, had received straightforward directives that morning from divisional headquarters. Processing procedures called for identity verification, screening against war crimes databases maintained by Allied intelligence services, and immediate release of personnel not flagged for detention. The European conflict had concluded. Military government policy prioritized rapid demobilization of enemy forces to reduce occupation costs and facilitate Germany's administrative reconstruction. Henderson conducted his inspection tour of the compound that afternoon, accompanied by his executive officer, Captain William Thorne, and interpreter Sergeant Ernst Kaufmann. The sergeant, a German Jewish refugee who had emigrated to America in 1938, brought complex perspectives to his assignment. His family had fled Munich after Kristallnacht. His linguistic capabilities proved essential for military government operations, though the work forced daily confrontation with the nation that had destroyed his former life. The prisoners represented diverse backgrounds according to personnel files compiled during initial processing. Service records documented telecommunications specialists, administrative clerks, medical auxiliaries, and supply management personnel. Most had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht Schelferne, Wehrmacht's female auxiliary service between 1943 and 1944 as German manpower reserves became critically depleted. Ages ranged from 19 to 46 years. Pre-war occupations included teachers, shopkeepers, farmers' wives, and clerical workers. If you appreciate evidence-based World War II history presented without sensationalism, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. Henderson ordered the prisoners assembled in the main compound yard for a formal address. The women formed loose groupings, their demeanor suggesting exhaustion rather than the military discipline they had once maintained. Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, now stripped of insignia per Allied regulations, showed wear from months of military service under increasingly desperate conditions during Germany's final collapse. Understanding the prisoners. Circumstances requires examination of Germany's female auxiliary mobilization during the war's latter phases. The Wehrmacht established the Wehrmacht Schelfern organization in 1940, initially as a volunteer service. By 1943, facing catastrophic manpower losses on the Eastern Front, German authorities expanded female conscription significantly. Official Oberkommando der Wehrmacht records indicate approximately 450,000 women served in auxiliary roles by early 1945. These auxiliaries performed functions that freed male personnel for combat assignments. Primary duties included military telecommunications, administrative processing, supply logistics, medical services, and air defense operations. The women received military ranks, wore uniforms, and operated under military discipline, though Wehrmacht policy officially classified them as civilian employees rather than full combatants under international law interpretations of that era. Service conditions deteriorated sharply during Germany's military collapse in early 1945. As Allied forces advanced from west and east, auxiliary units frequently found themselves in combat zones. Soviet military doctrine made limited distinction between Wehrmacht combatants and auxiliaries during the Red Army as advanced through German territory. Historical documentation compiled by international relief organizations after the war recorded widespread violence against female auxiliary personnel captured by Soviet forces though exact statistics remain subject to scholarly debate due to incomplete records and Cold War-era information suppression. The women now held at Henderson's facility represented survivors of Germany's final military disintegration. Their service records, meticulously maintained by German military bureaucracy even as the Reich collapsed, showed postings across multiple theaters. Some had served in communication centers in Berlin during the final Soviet assault. Others had staffed Wehrmacht administrative offices in Bavaria as American forces advanced. None showed evidence of direct participation in war crimes, according to initial Allied intelligence screening protocols. Major Henderson mounted the wooden platform erected for the assembly, Sergeant Kaufmann positioned beside him for interpretation. The announcement he was about to deliver followed standard procedures established by Third Army, headquarters for prisoner processing. These protocols reflected broader occupation policies developed by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force under General Dwight Eisenhower as command. Henderson began the formal address, speaking clearly as Kaufmann translated into German. The war in Europe had concluded with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. Allied authorities had verified the prisoners' identities through Wehrmacht personnel records and cross-referenced names against databases of individuals wanted for war crimes or crimes against humanity. None of the women at this facility appeared on those lists. Therefore, under military government regulations, they were classified as low-priority detainees eligible for immediate release. The announcement continued with specific details. The compound gates would open within 1 hour. Each woman would receive documentation confirming her release status, basic food rations sufficient for 3 days, and information about Red Cross registration points for displaced persons. They were free to return to their homes, locate family members, or seek civilian employment in occupied Germany. U.S. military government authorities wished them success during the difficult reconstruction period ahead. Henderson anticipated relief, perhaps emotional displays of gratitude. The reaction he observed instead suggested a fundamental disconnect between American military expectations and German civilian reality. Rather than celebration, visible distress spread through the assembled prisoners. Women who had maintained composed military bearing suddenly appeared physically weakened, shoulders dropping, faces draining of color. The response indicated something profoundly wrong with assumptions underlying the release procedures. Oberfeldwebel Clara Brenner, a 35-year-old communications specialist according to her service file, stepped forward from the formation. Her hands trembled despite efforts to maintain military composure. She requested permission to address the American commander directly. Henderson, surprised by the breach of expected protocol, granted permission through Kaufmann's translation. Brenner chose her words carefully, speaking formal German that Kaufmann rendered into precise English. Major Henderson and his staff needed to understand what freedom actually meant for German women in May 1945. Brenner's own situation illustrated the broader crisis. Her home city was Breslau, now located behind Soviet occupation lines in territory that would be transferred to Polish administration under Allied agreements. The city had endured a siege lasting from February through May 1945. Red Army forces had occupied Breslau on May 6th. Brenner had received no communication from her mother and sister, last known to be in the city since February. Historical records compiled by the International Committee of the Red Cross document the refugee catastrophe that unfolded across Eastern Europe in 1945. Approximately 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from territories east of the Oder-Neisse line, from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. The expulsions, conducted under chaotic conditions during 1945-1946, resulted in an estimated 500,000 to 2 million deaths from violence, disease, and exposure, though exact figures remain disputed among historians. Brenner continued her explanation, identifying other prisoners by name. Frau Hilda Richter's village near Königsberg in East Prussia no longer existed as part of Germany. The region was being transferred to Soviet administration, later becoming Kaliningrad. Frühlin Margaret Schiller's family residence in Dresden had been destroyed during the Allied bombing raids of February 1945, which killed an estimated 25,000 civilians, according to post-war German assessments. Even women whose homes were in Western Germany faced severe displacement. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt lay in ruins, with civilian populations scattered across refugee camps. The prisoners had no addresses to return to, Brenner stated plainly. Their families were displaced, scattered, or deceased. The infrastructure that had supported pre-war German civilian life had been systematically destroyed through 5 years of total war, culminating in Germany's absolute defeat and occupation. Henderson felt Captain Thorne's shift position beside him, recognizing that their assumptions about post-surrender conditions required immediate recalibration. Brenner's presentation continued with information that explained the prisoners' apparent dread of release. She addressed an issue that American military personnel understood but rarely discussed in official contexts. German women who had served in Wehrmacht auxiliary services faced specific dangers when encountering Soviet military forces, Brenner explained with careful deliberation. The situation was particularly acute for those from eastern regions, or those who had been captured briefly by Red Army units before subsequent liberation by American forces. Declassified reports from American military intelligence and accounts compiled by international relief organizations provide historical context for Brenner's concerns. The Soviet advance through Germany during January-May 1945 was accompanied by extensive violence against German civilians. Soviet military leadership made explicit connections between German atrocities committed during the invasion of the Soviet Union and acceptable conduct during the Red Army's retribution. Female Wehrmacht auxiliaries, perceived as active participants in the German military that had devastated Soviet territory, faced particularly harsh treatment. American historian Anthony Beever's research, published decades later using Soviet archives, estimated that up to 2 million German women experienced sexual violence during the Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany, though these figures remain subject to historical debate. Contemporary Allied intelligence reports from 1945 documented systematic patterns of assault, though exact documentation was limited and politically sensitive given wartime alliance politics. Brenner's statement continued with practical assessment of civilian conditions in defeated Germany. The American military presence provided order and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Outside the compound's perimeter, however, Germany existed in a state of near anarchy. Approximately 11 million displaced persons from across Europe wandered German roads. Food distribution systems had collapsed. Currency had lost meaningful value. Criminal activity flourished in the absence of functional German police authority. Most dangerous, Brenner noted, were German men, former soldiers and civilians who now blamed women for supporting the regime that had led Germany to catastrophic defeat. Hilda Richter stepped forward to provide her personal circumstances. According to her service record, she was 43 years old, widowed since her husband's death at Stalingrad in 1943. Before the war, she had managed her husband's grocery shop in East Prussia. That region was now under Soviet administration. Her shop no longer existed. Her 2 sons had disappeared somewhere during the Wehrmacht's retreat from the Eastern Front in 1944. She possessed no surviving family members, no residence, no occupation, and no prospects. Richter posed a direct question to Major Henderson. If American authorities released her immediately, where precisely should she go? She would become another starving refugee on roads already congested with millions of displaced persons. Based on accounts from women who had already been released from military custody, she could expect robbery within hours and sexual assault by dawn. Her survival chances outside protective custody were minimal. Henderson observed Sergeant Kaufmann's face pale during translation. The sergeant's own family history fleeing Nazi persecution. Losing relatives in the Holocaust created complex emotional dynamics, yet Kaufmann's professionalism held. He continued translating with accuracy despite visible distress. Margaret Schiller, identified in records as a telecommunications officer who had supervised communications for an entire Wehrmacht division, provided the prisoners' concluding argument. The women were not requesting comfortable imprisonment or extended detention out of loyalty to the defeated regime. They were requesting survival in the most basic sense. The compound provided food-limited rations, but more reliable than anything available in civilian Germany. The facility offered shelter, protection, and most critically, American soldiers who followed Geneva Convention protocols rather than the revenge dynamics governing much of occupied Germany. Schiller's statement included a disclaimer that would become significant in subsequent negotiations. The prisoners were not claiming to be Nazi Party members, she stated clearly. Most had never been ideologically committed to National Socialism. They had served because German law required their service, because their male relatives were already fighting, because the nation demanded contributions to the war effort. They acknowledged complicity in the German military system. But they had been ordinary Germans attempting to survive a war they had not initiated and could not terminate. Captain Thorne leaned toward Henderson with quiet observation. This situation was highly irregular by any military administrative standard. Henderson agreed, but faced a tactical decision requiring immediate resolution. He asked for a show of hands how many prisoners preferred to remain in American custody rather than accept immediate release. Hands rose across the compound yard. First dozens, then additional women raised their arms. Margaret Schiller conducted a quick count, 243 hands visible, representing more than 80% of the facility's prisoner population. The majority of German female prisoners of war were explicitly requesting continued imprisonment. Henderson recognized this required reporting through command channels. General George S. Patton, 3rd Army Commander, would likely want direct involvement in policy decisions regarding this unprecedented situation. Henderson had encountered numerous unexpected scenarios during 26 months of combat operations from Normandy, through the Ardennes, and across the Rhine. This situation ranked among the most unusual in his military experience. The following day, May 9, 1945, Henderson placed a telephone call to 3rd Army headquarters in Bad Tschus. Colonel Morrison, the operations officer who received his report, expressed frank disbelief. Morrison read Henderson's written summary aloud, seeking confirmation that German prisoners of war were requesting to delay their release. Henderson confirmed the assessment and provided rationale. The prisoners had presented logical arguments regarding their safety and survival prospects outside American military custody. Morrison warned that General Patton would respond negatively to complications in prisoner processing. 3rd Army now administered millions of German civilians, operated extensive refugee assistance programs, and managed complex military government operations across Bavaria. The last thing headquarters needed was German military personnel volunteering for extended American custody, creating precedent that could complicate the entire demobilization effort. Henderson proposed an alternative framework. The female prisoners possessed valuable skills, telecommunications training, clerical expertise, administrative experience, medical knowledge. Germany's reconstruction required exactly these capabilities. Rather than simple prisoner detention, Henderson suggested establishing a voluntary civilian employment program. The women would work as paid employees in American military government administration while receiving assistance locating surviving family members and identifying safe permanent situations. This reframed the arrangement from imprisonment to transitional employment. Colonel Morrison acknowledged the proposal's merit, but identified significant bureaucratic obstacles. Any such program required approval through multiple military government channels. Legal review was necessary to ensure compliance with surrender terms and Geneva Convention obligations. The concept would need formal policy development before implementation at scale. Morrison provided interim guidance. Henderson should maintain the prisoners at his facility under existing detention protocols, while headquarters developed appropriate policy frameworks. However, Morrison emphasized this arrangement was explicitly temporary. The Army could not operate prisoner-of-war camps for volunteer detainees as a long-term solution. Henderson spent subsequent days reviewing individual service records for the 300 women under his command. Each personnel file represented disrupted lives and uncertain futures. One file selected at random documented Elfried Hartmann, age 22, from Hamburg, trained as a communications specialist. Both parents had been killed in RAF bombing raids in 1943. Her brother was missing on the Eastern Front. No living relatives had been located through Red Cross inquiries. American military government officials releasing Miss Hartmann into homeless displacement offered no meaningful path to survival. Margaret Schiller requested a formal meeting with Major Henderson several days later. She arrived at his office escorted by Sergeant Kaufman, maintaining military protocol despite her status as a prisoner addressing her captor. Schiller presented a structured proposal developed through discussions among the prisoners. The women recognized that their continued presence created logistical burdens for American authorities: consumption of food supplies, requirement for guard details, occupation of facility space. The prisoners proposed to perform work in exchange for continued protection and basic provisions. Many prisoners possessed highly relevant administrative skills, Schiller explained. Frau Becker had been a professional accountant before the war. Fräulein Weber had worked in hospital administration. Schiller herself had supervised telecommunications operations for an entire Wehrmacht division, managing technical personnel and complex communications networks under combat conditions. These skills could support American military government operations, which Henderson knew were overwhelmed with administrative workload. The proposal specifically offered assistance with displaced persons' paperwork processing, communication support, supply management, and any other administrative functions that Third Army Headquarters required. In exchange, the women requested only shelter, food, and sufficient time to locate safe situations before releasing to civilian Germany. Henderson recognized the practical value of this proposal. Third Army Headquarters was indeed drowning in administrative requirements. American military government now governed millions of German civilians, processed endless columns of refugees from across Europe, managed supply logistics stretching across the continent, and documented war crimes evidence for future tribunal proceedings. Skilled administrative workers would provide significant operational value. Henderson informed Schiller that he would include this proposal in his formal submission to headquarters, but required absolute clarity on one fundamental point: this would constitute voluntary work. The women would remain technically free to depart the facility at any time. Schiller confirmed understanding of this paradox. The prisoners were requesting what she termed voluntary imprisonment because the alternative represented worse outcomes. After Schiller departed, Sergeant Kaufman remained to speak privately with Major Henderson. Kaufman requested permission to speak frankly, which Henderson always granted. The sergeant lit a cigarette with shaking hands before explaining his conflicted perspective. His family had fled Munich in 1938 as Nazi persecution intensified. When Kaufman joined the U.S. Army, he had been motivated by anger and desire to destroy Germany for what the Nazi regime had done to European Jews, to his family, to civilization itself. Yet the women in this compound, Kaufman observed, were not SS personnel. They were not Gestapo agents. They were ordinary people who had been caught in machinery larger than themselves: the German military system, the Nazi state, the catastrophic total war that consumed Europe from 1939 through 1945. Kaufman struggled with the recognition that individual Germans were not necessarily equivalent to the Nazi regime they had served. Henderson acknowledged Kaufman's perspective, but maintained focus on immediate practical decisions. The formal response from 3rd Army Headquarters arrived on May 15th, delivered by courier, along with extensive additional directives regarding occupation policy. Colonel Morrison had worked quickly through the Byzantine military bureaucracy to create what would officially be termed a Voluntary Labor Auxiliary Program. The authorization allowed Henderson to establish a pilot program under specific terms. Henderson assembled the women in the compound yard on the morning of May 15th for a formal announcement. They formed loose organization, positioned between military formation and civilian gathering, an accurate reflection of their ambiguous status between soldier, prisoner, and occupied person. Henderson read the official authorization document, though he had memorized its contents during a sleepless night reviewing implications. The terms were structured as follows. First, the women would no longer be classified as prisoners of war. Their official designation would change to civilian auxiliaries under military supervision. Second, they would perform administrative and logistical work for United States military government operations in Bavaria. Third, they would receive basic wages of 50 Reichsmarks per month plus standard rations and accommodation. 50 Reichsmarks represented minimal value given Germany's currency collapse, but the rations and accommodation ensured survival. Fourth, the women could terminate their participation at any time. They were not prisoners, but workers who had chosen structured environment during Germany's transition period. Fifth, American authorities would provide assistance locating families and identifying permanent civilian employment as opportunities developed. Henderson asked for questions. Hilda Richter inquired whether the women would be permitted to write letters searching for family members. Henderson confirmed that Red Cross and military mail services would be available for family location efforts. Elfried Hartmann asked whether supervised activities outside the compound would be permitted. Henderson explained that initially, the women would remain within the facility while protocols were established, but eventual gradual reintegration into civilian life was the program's stated objective, not permanent detention. Clara Brunner stepped forward to formally accept the terms on behalf of the women present. She also expressed gratitude, acknowledging that Major Henderson had not been required to develop this solution. Henderson felt uncomfortable with gratitude. He had acted from a mixture of compassion and pragmatism. The army needed workers. The women needed protection. Improvised solutions were necessary across occupied Germany in May 1945. Captain Thorne began processing new documentation that day, preparing identification papers, establishing the women's civilian auxiliary status. The bureaucratic redesignation represented more than administrative formality. It fundamentally altered their legal status under occupation law and provided protection through official American military government authorization. Margaret Schiller approached Henderson privately several days later for a confidential discussion. They walked to the compound's edge, away from potential listeners, with guards maintaining distance but surveillance. Schiller indicated there was information Henderson should understand regarding the women's desperation to remain in American custody. Several of the younger prisoners, Schiller estimated 20 to 30 women, were not simply concerned about general chaos in defeated Germany. They were terrified of specific revenge, particularly those from areas overrun by the Red Army. Some had escaped just ahead of Soviet advance in early 1945. Others had been captured briefly by Red Army units before subsequent liberation by American forces during the final weeks of the war. Schiller did not elaborate extensively, recognizing that Henderson understood the implications. Reports from the Eastern Front were explicit regarding systematic sexual violence during the Soviet advance through Germany. Historical documentation from the Soviet advance, though politically suppressed during Cold War decades, eventually confirmed extensive atrocities against German civilians with female Wehrmacht auxiliaries facing particularly harsh treatment as collaborators in the German invasion that had devastated the Soviet Union. Schiller continued with more disturbing information. 3 women in the compound had attempted suicide in the weeks before arriving at this facility. Fellow prisoners had intervened and prevented those deaths. The women were alive but psychologically fragile. The structure provided by American custody, the guards, the sense of safety, the predictable routine was maintaining their survival. Without this protected environment, Schiller feared what outcomes might occur. Henderson felt anger rising, though he struggled to identify appropriate targets. The Nazi regime that had initiated this catastrophe, the Soviet forces that had responded with atrocity, the abstraction of total war itself, which reduced human beings to statistics and trauma. He informed Schiller that he would ensure Captain Ross, the facility's medical officer, was made aware of these situations. Ross had experience treating combat trauma and might provide appropriate support. Schiller hesitated before adding personal context. She had joined the Wehrmacht auxiliary service in 1941 with genuine pride and ideological commitment. She had believed German propaganda about national defense, about international conspiracies against Germany, about the justified nature of German military actions. Looking back from May 1945, she recognized how naive and blind she and millions of other Germans had been. Henderson responded quietly that Schiller had not been alone in believing propaganda, his own country, had produced similar distortions regarding other groups. Schiller interrupted with a single word that hung between them like an accusation: Auschwitz. Henderson had no response. American forces had not built Auschwitz. The distinction between complicity in Nazi Germany's military system and responsibility for the Holocaust's industrial genocide created moral complexity that Henderson was not equipped to fully navigate. The Voluntary Labor Auxiliary Program officially commenced on June 1, 1945, with 267 women enrolled. 33 prisoners had opted for immediate release, accepting displacement risks in exchange for the possibility of locating surviving family members. Henderson arranged military transport, taking them as far as possible toward their destinations, along with ration cards and letters of transit, though he privately doubted many would reach their intended locations safely. The remaining women were organized into work details based on documented skills. Margaret Schiller headed a communications office processing military message traffic for Third Army operations. Clara Brenner supervised a typing pool handling occupation paperwork. Hilda Richter managed supply inventories. Elfried Hartmann worked with Army Postal Services, helping route mail for millions of displaced persons across occupied Germany. According to research compiled in the historical volume Aftermath, Life in the Post-War Rubble by historian James Peyton, published in 1973, such improvised arrangements were common across occupied Germany, though rarely documented officially due to their irregular nature that existed outside standard military government protocols. The work was demanding. American military government in Bavaria processed thousands of documents daily: displaced person registrations, denazification questionnaire, supply requisitions, communications between headquarters and forward units. The women worked 8-hour shifts 6 days per week, significantly longer than Geneva Convention prescribed for prisoners of war, but considerably less than they had worked during wartime Wehrmacht service. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison arrived from the United States in early June to oversee women's auxiliary programs across Third Army's occupation zone. She was 28 years old, a graduate of Wellesley College, and had spent the past 2 years managing Women's Army Corps' administrative services in England. Now she found herself responsible for former enemy personnel under circumstances no training manual had addressed. Morrison reviewed personnel files in Henderson's office, expressing concern about precedent. The women's situations were indeed heartbreaking, she acknowledged, but she questioned broader implications. If information spread through refugee networks that American facilities offered relative safety for German women, what would prevent hundreds or thousands more from requesting admission? Henderson agreed this concern was valid. The program was not being publicized and was intended as a localized solution to a specific problem, with most women expected to transition to civilian positions or family reunification by autumn. Morrison raised the fundamental question: what happens if stabilization takes longer than anticipated? Germany would require years to rebuild. Some women might never locate their families. Would they become permanent American dependents? Henderson had no satisfactory answer. He shifted the discussion to practical integration questions. How were the German women relating to American women as Army Corps personnel at the facility? Morrison's expression softened. Integration was better than expected. She had anticipated hostility. These women had literally been enemies weeks earlier. But WAC personnel seemed to view the German women more as survivors than adversaries. Informal relationships were developing. Corporal Jenkins was teaching English phrases to younger German women. Sergeant Williams shared cigarette rations. Henderson observed wryly that tobacco functioned as international diplomacy. Over subsequent weeks, routine solidified. The compound began feeling less like a prisoner camp and more like temporary workers' barracks. Women formed friendships across the divide that had recently separated them as enemies. They shared photographs of absent families, taught each other songs, traded stories about their pre-war homes and lives. But the outside world kept intruding painfully. In mid-June, Hilda Richter received notification through Red Cross channels. Her village near Nigsburg was confirmed as part of Soviet-annexed territory, transferred to Soviet administration under the Potsdam Conference agreements then being negotiated. Her home no longer existed as a physical structure or legal address. She was officially stateless, a woman from nowhere, with no recognized citizenship or property rights. Richter accepted the news quietly, folding the Red Cross letter with trembling hands. The summer heat settled over Bavaria in July 1945, bringing the first real crisis for Henderson's experimental program. A group of discharged Wehrmacht soldiers, ragged and bitter, had gathered outside the compound fence. They were drawn by rumors that German women were living comfortably under American protection, while German men starved in the ruins. Sergeant Kaufman brought Henderson the report early in the morning. Approximately 40 former soldiers were outside, most appearing as though they had just been released from Soviet prisoner camps. Barely alive, angry. Henderson pulled on his uniform jacket and grabbed his sidearm. Captain Thorne and a squad of military police followed as he strode toward the main gate. The scene exceeded Kaufman's description in ugliness. The former soldiers, some missing limbs, all missing hope, pressed against the outer fence, shouting abuse at the women visible in the compound yard. Their words were vicious, laden with rage that came from watching their nation crumble and finding someone weaker to blame. Henderson announced his identity and authority in English, with Kaufman translating. This was a United States military facility. The men would disperse immediately or face arrest. A man with one arm missing and a face full of scars stepped forward, responding in German that this was Germany, not America. These women were Germans, and they lived better than German men while veterans starved. Henderson explained that the women were civilian employees performing administrative work, earning their rations through labor, exactly as the men could do if they registered with military government employment offices. The one-armed veteran laughed bitterly. There was no employment, he said, only ruins. They had fought for 6 years, and this was their reward, watching German women serve the victors while German men begged for scraps. Henderson felt unexpected sympathy for these men despite their hostility. They had been soldiers, likely conscripts like many of the women inside the fence. They had survived hell on the Eastern Front and returned to a Germany that no longer existed. But sympathy could not override security requirements. Henderson stated that he understood their anger and understood Germany's desperate situation. But threatening these women would not improve their circumstances. It would only result in arrest and imprisonment. A voice shouted that the women should be outside suffering like the men. From inside the compound, Clara Brenner had organized the women to move back from the fence, away from the confrontation. But Margaret Schiller pushed forward instead, her face set with determination. She requested permission from Major Henderson to speak directly to the men. Henderson started to refuse, but something in her expression stopped him. He warned her to be careful. Schiller approached the fence, close enough that the men could see her clearly, but separated by 2 layers of wire and 20 feet of no man's land. She spoke in German, her voice carrying across the distance. She identified herself as Hauptmann Margaret Schiller, formerly of the Wehrmacht Communication Service. She acknowledged their anger and understood their pain. All Germans were victims of a war their leaders had started and could not win. The one armed man spat on the ground, saying, "Victims," while the women sat comfortably and men starved. Schiller continued, ignoring the interruption. She had lost a brother, Oberleutnant Franz Schiller, killed at Kursk in 1943. She had lost a fiancé, Hauptmann Wilhelm Brandl, captured at Stalingrad with no word in 2 years. Her parents had been killed when Dresden burned in February 1945. She had no home to return to, no family to rejoin. She was as lost as any of them. Her words seemed to puncture some of the rage. Men shifted uncomfortably, their anger seeking targets but finding only fellow sufferers. Schiller continued more quietly. The women were not living in comfort. They were surviving day by day, trying to endure long enough to rebuild something from the ruins. If the men wanted to hate someone, hate the leaders who led Germany into catastrophe. Hate the Nazis who promised victory and delivered annihilation. But do not hate women for trying to stay alive. The one armed veteran stared at Schiller for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Slowly, grudgingly, the others followed. Within 10 minutes, the crowd had dispersed, melting back into the destroyed landscape of post-war Germany. Henderson released a breath he had not realized he was holding, observing to Schiller that her action was either brave or foolish. Schiller responded that in Germany now, those were the same thing. The Potsdam Conference concluded in August 1945, with Allied leaders redrawing Europe's map and formalizing Germany's division into occupation zones. For the women in Henderson's program, geopolitical realignment meant more immediate concerns. The refugee crisis had intensified as millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern European territories, creating humanitarian catastrophe that strained every available resource. Lieutenant Morrison entered Henderson's office with a troubled expression, carrying a telegram from 3rd Army headquarters. They had new directives about the auxiliary program. The senior command wanted significant expansion. Henderson looked up from the Nazification questionnaire he had been reviewing, recognizing trouble in Morrison's tone. Morrison explained that headquarters wanted similar programs established at 6 additional facilities across the American occupation zone. Apparently, word had reached Eisenhower's staff that Henderson had successfully employed former Wehrmacht women in administrative roles. Now they wanted to systematize this as part of occupation infrastructure. This should have been validation that Henderson's improvised solution worked. Instead, it felt like bureaucracy was about to crush something fragile and human beneath policy and procedure. Morrison continued reading from the telegram. Inspectors were coming. Someone from the Inspector General's office, plus a team from the War Department. They wanted to ensure proper standards were maintained and that the facilities were not running what one memo termed inappropriate fraternization centers. Henderson felt anger flash through him. Fraternization centers? These were survivors trying to stay alive, not comfort stations. Morrison said quietly that the memo had been written by someone in Washington who had never seen what Germany looked like in August 1945. She continued, the investigators also wanted to examine individual cases, verifying that none of the women had hidden Nazi affiliations, that they were genuinely displaced, and that they were not manipulating the system. Henderson responded flatly that all the women were displaced. There was no system to manipulate. Working 8-hour shifts processing paperwork in exchange for food and shelter was hardly a luxury resort. The inspection team arrived 4 days later. Colonel Andrew Bartlett from the Inspector General's office was accompanied by 2 civilian analysts from the War Department and a major named Stevens who seemed determined to find problems. Henderson assembled the female auxiliaries in the compound yard for review. They stood in neat rows, not quite military formation but organized, wearing civilian clothes issued to replace their Wehrmacht uniforms. Each woman wore a blue armband marked CLA for Civilian Labor Auxiliary, distinguishing them from other displaced persons. Colonel Bartlett was a career officer who had spent the war in administrative postings. He walked slowly along the rows, examining the women with detached interest, inspecting equipment rather than human beings. Bartlett observed that the women appeared healthy, well-fed, and organized. Henderson's reports had indicated desperate refugees requiring protective custody. What Bartlett saw looked more like a comfortable garrison. With respect, Henderson responded. The women were healthy and well-fed now because American authorities had been feeding them. When they arrived in May, half were malnourished and all were traumatized. Medical care, regular meals, and structured work, that was what protective custody meant. Major Stevens flipped through a notebook. He had reviewed personnel files. These women had collectively performed clerical work equivalent to 40 American WAC personnel. That was impressive productivity, Stevens observed. Suspiciously impressive. Was Henderson certain they were not being coerced? Before Henderson could respond, Clara Brenner stepped forward. She had been coaching the women on what to expect, but decided protocol could be damned. She requested permission to address the question directly. Bartlett raised an eyebrow, noting that Brenner spoke English. Brenner confirmed she was learning enough English to tell them this. The women worked hard because they were grateful. In the compound, they were safe, fed, treated with dignity. Outside the fences was chaos, starvation, violence. They worked hard because they wished to remain, not because they were forced. Stevens looked skeptical, asking if all the women felt this way. Brenner said firmly to ask any of them, they would tell him the same. The inspection concluded with mixed results. Colonel Bartlett's official report, which Henderson received through command channels, acknowledged the program's effectiveness while raising concerns about long-term sustainability and recommending stringent oversight. Major Stevens filed a minority opinion arguing the arrangement was improper and should be terminated. More importantly, Third Army ordered the expansion to proceed despite Stevens's objections. 6 new facilities would establish similar civilian labor auxiliary programs by October. Henderson found himself designated as advisor, tasked with helping other commanders navigate the complexities he had learned through improvisation. But success brought unexpected complications. As word spread through refugee networks that American facilities offered relative safety for German women, hundreds more began requesting admission. Henderson's compound, designed for 300, now housed 412, with waiting lists growing daily. Lieutenant Morrison argued during a staff meeting that they could not keep expanding. They were beyond capacity, straining resources, losing the personalized oversight that made the program work initially. The women were becoming numbers instead of individuals. Henderson knew Morrison was correct. The original group, the 267 who had begged to stay in May, had formed cohesive community. They knew each other, supported each other, functioned as a collective unit. But new arrivals disrupted that dynamic, bringing fresh trauma and different expectations. Margaret Schiller recognized the same problem. She appeared at Henderson's office unannounced one evening, finding him at his desk under lamplight, working through requisition forms. She needed to talk about the new women. Henderson gestured to a chair, indicating he was listening. Schiller explained that the original group had gone through the collapse together, made choices together, understood what this place was and what it was not. But new arrivals sometimes thought this was a refugee camp, a permanent solution. They did not understand this was temporary, that eventually they must rejoin German society. Henderson asked if they did not integrate well. Schiller said they were different kinds of survivors. Some new arrivals had lived through things that she trailed off, struggling with English vocabulary, things that break the mind. They needed doctors, not work programs. Captain Ross, the medical officer, had flagged several cases: women who sat catatonic for hours, women who woke screaming every night, women who flinched at sudden movements or male voices. Henderson said they were doing what they could with Captain Ross's limited psychiatric resources. Schiller acknowledged this, but worried the place was becoming something Henderson had not intended: a holding space for the broken, rather than a transition toward healing. Henderson asked what she would suggest. Schiller proposed smaller groups with more individual attention. Perhaps women from the original group could help, understanding what the new arrivals were experiencing, speaking the same language literally and figuratively. Let them be counselors, advocates, bridges between American staff and new arrivals. It was a solid proposal, though it raised questions about authority structures and civilian oversight. But the entire program existed in gray zones between military order and humanitarian improvisation. One more ambiguity would not matter. Henderson instructed Schiller to draw up a formal proposal and work with Lieutenant Morrison to structure it properly. Before leaving, Schiller asked Henderson a personal question. Why had he done this? When the women asked to stay, he could have refused, followed orders, released them, and let them face whatever came. It would have been easier for him. Why choose the difficult path? Henderson thought about his answer for a long moment. He had a daughter, Patricia, 18 years old, about to start university. When he looked at younger women in the compound, he saw her. He thought about what would happen if she were in their circumstances, if America had lost, if everything collapsed, if she had nowhere to go. He would hope someone somewhere would show her mercy. Schiller responded that his daughter was fortunate to have such a father. Henderson replied that he was fortunate; she would never need to learn that lesson. Germany made terrible choices, he continued, as a nation, as a military, as a people. But punishment should fall on those who made the choices, not on every individual who happened to be German when the catastrophe arrived. A telegram arrived October 3rd. Wilhelm Müller, a former Wehrmacht officer recently released from American POW detention, had filed formal complaint with military government. He alleged that Henderson's facility was providing preferential treatment to German women while German men starved in ruins. He demanded investigation and closure of what he termed comfort arrangements between occupiers and occupied. The accusation was inflammatory and largely false, but it gained traction among displaced German men who saw auxiliary programs as evidence of American favoritism toward women. Demonstrations occurred outside 3 of the new facilities. Rocks were thrown, windows broken. In one incident, a mob attempted to storm a compound gate, resulting in 2 German civilians shot by American guards. Lieutenant Morrison spread newspaper clippings across Henderson's desk. German-language papers were running stories about privileged women in American custody, stoking resentment in a population desperate for scapegoats. The press was turning this into a scandal. Henderson read the articles, recognizing distortion and propaganda even through German text, but also recognizing genuine grievance underneath the exaggeration. German men had returned from the war to find their nation destroyed, their status eliminated, their futures erased. Seeing women apparently sheltered by the victors must have felt like salt in already raw wounds. Henderson concluded they needed to clarify what the program actually was and needed to accelerate transitioning women into permanent civilian situations. Morrison responded that there were not enough permanent situations. Germany's economy was shattered. There were no jobs, no housing, no infrastructure. Where should they go? It was the same question that had started this program in May. 6 months later in November, the answer remained elusive. November 6, 1945. 6 months to the day since the women first refused release, Henderson stood in the compound yard watching autumn leaves scatter across the ground. The original group of 267 had shrunk to 193 as women gradually found placements, located surviving family members, or decided to risk the outside world. But 81 new women had arrived in their place, and another 100 waited on unofficial lists, hoping for admission that might never come. The program had metastasized beyond its original intent, becoming simultaneously more necessary and more unsustainable with each passing week. Margaret Schiller approached carrying a folder with updated placement reports Henderson had requested. Hilda Richter had finally been placed with a farming family near Munich, needing experienced management, offering room and board in exchange for work. Elfried Hartmann had secured clerical position with the Red Cross in Frankfurt. Clara Brenner had been hired by American military government as civilian translator, one of the first from the program to achieve such placement. Success stories, each one. But for every woman who found a path forward, 3 more arrived with nowhere to go. Henderson asked Schiller a question, using her first name, a familiarity developed over months of collaboration. If he could return to May, would she still have asked to stay? Schiller considered carefully, watching other women cross the yard toward the mess hall. Yes, she said finally. Staying gave them time to grieve, time to heal, time to understand what Germany had become. If he had released them that first day, some would not have survived the summer. They would have died in the chaos, died by their own hands, or died inside while their bodies kept walking. She turned to face Henderson directly. This place was never paradise, barely adequate. But it was a space between the war they had survived and the peace they had to learn to inhabit. Henderson had given them that space. That was enough. In Berlin, the Allied Control Council was finalizing plans for Germany's future, division into zones, denazification procedures, economic reconstruction, democratic re-education, grand strategies for a broken nation. But Henderson had learned that history happened not in conference rooms, but in spaces like this compound, where individual human beings made individual choices about survival, dignity, and hope. Lieutenant Morrison entered the yard, accompanied by Henderson's replacement, Major Thomas Brennan, recently arrived from the States. Brennan was younger, efficient, full of ideas about systematizing the program. He had studied Henderson's reports and believed he could improve the improvised model. Brennan said formally that he had reviewed the facility impressive work under difficult circumstances. He thought with proper organization, they could increase capacity another 20%. Henderson shook his hand, noting Morrison's skeptical expression behind Brennan's shoulder. Morrison had learned, as Henderson had, that some problems could not be solved through increased efficiency. Some wounds healed on their own schedule, regardless of military planning. Henderson offered Brennan advice. These were not units to be managed, but people to be helped. The moment he forgot that distinction, he would lose what made the program work. Brennan responded with confidence that he would maintain Henderson's protocols while implementing modernization. Henderson did not argue. Brennan would learn, or he would not. The program would adapt or fail. Germany would heal, or it would not. Henderson had done what he could. That evening the women organized an informal farewell gathering for Henderson. No official ceremony, just coffee and salvaged cake in the mess hall. Awkward speeches in broken English. Small gifts carved from wood or sewn from scrap fabric. Margaret presented Henderson with a letter signed by all 193 women currently in the facility. Henderson read it later, alone in his quarters while packing for Berlin. The letter expressed gratitude that could not be repaid because what he had given could not be measured in money or goods. He had given them time, safety, and dignity when they had lost everything else. He had treated them as human beings when they had become only refugees and former enemies. Some would never see their families again. Some would carry scars that never fully healed. But all would remember that in the darkest moment of their lives, one American officer chose mercy over regulation, humanity over expedience. The letter concluded by noting they were not asking him to forgive Germany for what their nation had done, only to remember them as individuals who tried to survive, rebuild, and become worthy of the second chance he provided. Henderson folded the letter carefully and placed it in his footlocker, next to his daughter Patricia's last letter from home and his wife Barbara's photograph. Years from now, when war memories had faded into dinner table stories, he would take out this letter and remember the women who had begged to remain prisoners, because imprisonment meant survival. The paradox still seemed impossible: enemy combatants requesting continued captivity, captors struggling to provide freedom their prisoners feared. But that paradox captured something essential about the war's aftermath. Victory and defeat, liberation and occupation, justice and mercy, none existed in pure form. Everything was complicated. Everything was human. Everything required judgment calls no regulation or doctrine had anticipated. On November 7, 1945, Major Robert Henderson departed for Berlin, leaving behind a compound full of women navigating between past and future, between German and occupied person, between the nation they had served and the nation they would help rebuild. His experimental program would continue another 18 months before gradually dissolving as Germany stabilized and normal civilian life slowly, painfully reasserted itself. Most women eventually found their way to new families, new communities, new lives built from fragments of old ones. Some never fully recovered, carrying trauma like shrapnel embedded too deep to safely remove. A few remained in American employment for years, becoming bridges between occupiers and occupied, translators not just of language but of experience. Margaret Schiller would eventually work for American military government until 1949, then transitioned to civilian administration in the new Federal Republic of Germany. She never married, never had children, but became a mentor to younger women navigating post-war reconstruction. She lived until 1998, long enough to see Germany reunited and the occupation formally ended. In her personal papers donated to the German Federal Archives after her death, researchers found a photograph, a compound yard in Bavaria, autumn 1945, with women in blue armbands standing together, not quite prisoners and not quite free, but alive and together, and looking toward an uncertain future that at least existed. The photograph's caption, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, reads simply, "The day we begged to stay, and mercy answered." History remembers the great battles, the decisive moments, the famous names. But the aftermath of catastrophe happens in smaller spaces, in compounds where former enemies become collaborators, where improvised solutions address unprecedented problems, where individual choices about mercy or regulation determine whether survivors become statistics or human beings. In May 1945, 300 German women faced freedom and begged instead for captivity. By November, they had learned to walk that impossible line between past and future, to rebuild identity from ruins, to survive not just physically, but as human beings worthy of the second chance they had been granted. Their story, largely forgotten in the broader narrative of World War II's conclusion, remains testament to the complexity of human experience when ideologies collapse, and individual people must find ways to live with each other across the ruins of absolute conflict. They were not heroes, not villains, but survivors. And sometimes in the wreckage of history, survival itself is the most honest form of courage.